Hey guys, what is up? So, I have long wanted to make a commentary video about parrying and talk about parrying as a mechanic. This won't be a guide on how to parry people, nor a guide on how to avoid being parried. There's plenty of great videos on the former topic. I actually made a video myself about the latter topic. I will leave a link to that in the description. I want to talk about PvP parries, of course, not PvE parries. I've just long found them an interesting mechanic from a melee combat perspective. They can certainly turn the tide of a fight, either for good or for bad. And so I just want to talk about that. And I want to talk about a lot of related topics, the evolution of how parry strategies have changed since the launch of the game, who parries and why. That's certainly changed as well. Talk about duels versus invasions. There's certainly a lot of differences in parry strategies between the two, and also the strategies and how they differ between the gank and invaders, and also having the right mental approach to parries and a few other things as well. So let's go ahead and get started. So it's pretty interesting to me to look over the kind of the course of the game since launch until today in 2020 and see how the use of parries has evolved. So in one respect, and we'll talk more in detail about this later, when I look at launch, like 2016 to 2017, parries were definitely a core part of the invader's skill set and strategy. It was pretty typical to see an invader with the offhand parry tool and then main hand straight sword. I mean, that was like the de facto invader build for a long time. And interestingly, it was pretty rare to see the host or phantoms parry. I mean, they might make some attempts after they see you do it and kind of mimic it with their medium shield, but they were usually ham-fisted and really bad attempts, and clearly nothing that they had actually practiced or worked on. But in 2020, that relationship has been nearly inverted, and we'll talk in more detail about why I think that is. But I first want to talk about kind of the overall parry strategies and how they've evolved. So as an example, in the early going, it was pretty typical to go for things like the third R1 parry, the hit stun parry, the face tink parry. So your opponent swings twice, and then when they swing the third time, the hit stun is really light on the second R1. You throw the parry tool out and get a parry. Nobody does that anymore because nobody's stupid enough to fall for it. Obviously, there's exceptions to these, but that's a general rule. And so later strategies were things like hit stun parries, where your opponent would come out of hit stun and predictably mash R1 and you'd go to parry them. And now you see, I don't see those types of approaches very often. I see what I call more modern strategies, roll parries, mix up parries, essentially parries that are difficult for your opponent to read that they're incoming and difficult to punish with backstabs. So I think the evolution of these parry strategies was essentially driven by counter parry strategies. So as an example, if you see your opponent has a parry tool and you're both coming out of mutual hit stun, things like running to your opponent's back in case they try to go for the out of hit stun parry, those types of responses have forced people who do parry to mix up their approach and be less predictable in how they go for parries. So let's talk about parrying in duels versus invasions. Parries, in my view, have almost no place in duels. Of course, it's not entirely true, and we'll talk more that these types of decisions should always be made at the margin. So it's not a question of no parries or parry, it's a question of how often and when should you parry. But in duels, they don't make a lot of sense. They do make a lot more sense in invasions. We'll talk about exactly why that is. One of the reasons is, first of all, in invasions, you can say that the average player quality is lower, so your opponents are more likely to fall for parry baits, though that's less true now than really it's ever been. There's not a lot of people left playing, and the people that are left playing are pretty familiar with the mechanic, so it's not necessarily the case that they're easier to land in invasions than they are in duels. The answer to me is more around what I would call implied HP. And implied HP essentially means your total HP across a gaming session. So in a duel, your health is going to be determined by whatever your vigor gives you, plus ring effects, or if you use miracles, etc. But of course, in an invasion, your implied HP is going to be all of that, plus your Estus, plus your Siegs, and blessings if you use them. And the reason parries have value, of course, they do a lot of damage, but they do damage of a particular type. They do burst damage. And the idea is that if you land a parry at an opportune moment, you can prevent your opponent from ever getting to their flask. And an opponent that has 14 Estus left, you cut off a lot of their implied HP. That's the reason that parries have a lot of value. And it's why parries, in my view, have a lot less value in duels, where a slower chipping strategy is often going to be much more viable. And this has a couple of interesting implications. So the one implication is that the more healing items your opponent has, the greater the returns are to parrying, because the greater their implied HP pool, the greater the return to your parry attempts. Also, the more difficult it is to punish your opponent's heals, the greater the returns to parrying. And which also kind of leads us to an interesting place where we have two forces that are moving us in opposing direction. So on the one hand, it's a lot harder to land parries today, which would sort of argue for going for fewer parries. On the other hand, opponents often have more healing wares, which in my view argues for additional parries. And more healing wares can be Estus, it can be Siegs, it can be Blessings, or even in a gank, it could be one of the gank members that's casting Bountiful Sunlight or casting Healing Miracles. And it also means that with tech like Estus Cancel and Estus Refill, the arguments for parries become even stronger, because that implied HP pool is either larger, or because you're not going to be able to punish their healing attempts. So whether you choose to parry and when you choose to parry, essentially every facet of parry strategy is affected by the role you have in a fight. So for example, invaders versus gankers have very different trade-offs, and as a result, you'll see very different behavior from both groups. So let's talk about parrying in a gank. So like so many other strategies in text that are strong, they only get stronger when they're part of a gank. Parrying in a gank can be a nearly bulletproof strategy. The biggest drawback of parrying is often it's going to be the punish, either because you're going to whiff the parry and you're going to eat a couple of R1s, or even worse, you're going to get BS'd when you go for a very predictable parry. The gank neutralizes these parry punishes to such a strong extent, especially when the gank is all together. We've all seen situations where you're faced off against 2 or 3 players at a time, and the host goes for parry after parry after parry, and there is literally nothing that you can do to stop them, because you can't get to their back to punish their predictable parries. So that makes it really likely that the host is going to land a lucky parry, and in those situations you essentially just have to split the group up, because there's nothing that you can do. Ganks can also use mixed strategies super effectively. Like, let's say as an example, you land a parry on a gank member. While coming out of iframes, they can do things like one of them can wait to roll catch you, one of them can attack immediately, and another one can attempt to parry you. And that leaves you very few choices on how to exit that situation safely. When they utilize those powers effectively, there's really almost nothing at all that you can do. Similarly, as an invader, going for parries is exceptionally risky against a gank. I mean, gankers are not the stupid gankers of 2016 and 17. They know what you're going to do. Very often, they are former invaders themselves. So when they're running you down, at least one of them is always going to be running looking for a backstab if you're trying to parry. It's really not a very smart strategy. Now, you can go for parries against gankers, but you have to do it very safely. You have to consider who all is around you when you go for it. And even if you can safely land a parry against a gank member, they're usually on a mic, they're password summoned, so they're all going to come surround you as you come out of iframes. So what role you have in a fight hugely determines whether you should be going for parries and the overall sort of parry strategies that you can use. So parries by their nature are a high variance strategy, and really this explains why they can be so very annoying to deal with. It gives bad players a way to defeat good players, or maybe more specifically, it gives players who are worse than their opponent an opportunity to beat that opponent. So one of the clear implications is the better you are as a player relative to your opponent, the less often you should go for parries. And conversely, if you're outmatched by your opponent, well then that argues pretty strongly for going for more parries. So for example, if I were up against a top tier opponent that I knew I couldn't really beat in any other way, if we're facing off, their spacing's better, their timing's better, their reads are better, well then I'm going to have a pretty strong incentive to go for more parries and try to win the fight via a one shot. Most of the time, people who parry like this, parry spammers, they're really not of much concern, and you can usually play around them, but these parry spammers will always get lucky. Eventually, they are going to land parries against you. And that brings me to the next point, which is around having the right mental framework. So the first thing that you have to accept is everybody gets parried. Everybody gets parried. It happens to everyone. Getting parried is, of course, one of the most annoying feelings in the game. Everybody hates getting parried. It's super frustrating. But one of the things that I've learned to do is I've learned to really kind of let it slide off my back, and I don't let it bother me the way that I used to. And in fact, I used to play with what I call parry fear, where I would be so afraid of getting parried that it would completely neutralize any amount of aggression that I had. And that's really one of the worst things that you can do. And in fact, this is why it can often be a good idea to take a parry tool out, even if you don't intend to use it, just because fear of getting parried will help discipline the way that your opponents play. But whenever you get parried, you have to ask yourself a question. The question is, are you getting parried because your opponent is getting lucky, or are they getting reads against you? And in reality, the answer is almost always going to be a combination of the two. But you have to ask yourself, which factor is dominant? Are they getting reads against you, or are they just getting lucky? And unfortunately, in the context of any one fight, it's really hard to know. Sometimes it can look like somebody got a god read against you, but frankly, they just got lucky. And in fact, when I was first starting out in PvP, I would sometimes message other players that landed parries against me, thinking they got some god read, and they would confess, no, they just got lucky. They just decided to throw one out. Now, of course, deciding to throw one out could be a sort of subconscious read, and so it gets really hard to know. The approach that I've taken, I take a long run approach, and I tend to look at how often am I actually getting parried? How many times are my opponents whiffing parries versus how many times are they landing them? Now, I don't do an exact count or anything quite like that, but I have a general sort of gauge for this. And in my experience, it's usually my opponents are whiffing somewhere around 25 to 30 parries for every one that lands. And as long as I'm not getting parried more often than that, I feel pretty content that that's mostly luck. There's not much I can do about it. And I don't want to become too passive in an attempt to avoid getting parried. That's an even bigger risk. You have to maintain that aggression, and you just have to do it in a way that doesn't make you terribly predictable. You have to essentially make the cost of going for parries greater than the benefit of going for them. So I don't want to talk about parry strategies like hit stun, third R1 parries too much, but there is one parry type I do want to talk about just for a few minutes, simply because I find it to be really annoying, and that is roll parries. And I'm talking about players who parry out of rolls. And this was something you didn't used to see very often in the early days, and now it's become a really common approach to parrying. And the reason is pretty obvious, because it's really dangerous to try to punish this type of roll parry, and it takes what is normally a very defensive action like rolling and turns it into like this riposte lottery where somebody's going to land a lucky parry at you. And I'm sure we've all had the experience of chasing down gankers as they mindlessly spam roll after roll after roll, and then suddenly after the fourth roll they come out and they throw out a parry and they end up getting the riposte and killing you. Super frustrating. It seems to me that when you block with a shield coming out of a roll, that some of your vulnerability frames actually get canceled and get replaced by block frames. And I think parrying seems to operate in a similar way, where coming out of a roll, some of your vulnerability frames to getting roll caught actually get replaced with the parry, which is what makes it so treacherous. Now, I haven't actually looked at the frame data to see how many of these frames might get canceled or exactly what's going on here, but I'm pretty sure that's how it works. Though if anyone out there has broken this down or knows of any resources that have looked at this in more detail, I'd love it if you leave a link below in the comment section, and then I'll be sure to pin that rather, and share that with everyone else. The last thing I want to share here is something sort of interesting. So Mr. Silly Dog and I had been talking, and we were sort of wondering, what are really the odds of being parried in a very mindless sort of way? In other words, we've all seen the player that just stands there and just keeps pressing parry, 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 hoping eventually you'll swing into it. And we were wondering, well, what would happen if you just stood there and pressed parry, and then the other person pressed R1 at random? And so Silly and I tested this. And the way we tested it is one of us would press parry over and over, and the other player would look away from their screen but locked on and press R1 at random times. And then the question was, how often would parries actually land? And I was sort of surprised. I expected to be parried maybe 1 out of every 3 or out of every 4 attempts, but it was less than that. It was something like 1 out of every 10, but it had a really high variance. So sometimes you would get parried like 4 times in a row, and then other times you wouldn't get parried at all, like for 15 swings. So somebody who's just pressing parry like this, not as big a threat as I would have originally suspected, but it definitely is a bit of a risk. So just something to keep in mind. Guys, I hope that you enjoyed this content. I hope that you found something of value or something to think about. Thanks for stopping by. Take care now.